It's wonderful to have you all with me, and thank you for joining us for the last in our series. So this week we are going to turn to the topic of Jewish creativity in the Renaissance. And in Italy, we need to turn with enthusiasm to the Renaissance and its high achievements in all areas of the visual arts. The rebirth and the accompanying upsurge of creativity certainly left an impression on Jewish neighborhoods in Italy. Our case of Italian Jews is fascinating not only because of the immense wealth of the findings, but also their high level of decoration and their relative sophistication. We also witness a certain audaciousness shown by the artists and their Jewish patrons, unparalleled in traditional Jewish art of European communities. So I suggest that we do the following this evening. I want us to begin today by thinking about the issues in Judaism regarding the creation of visual images. What sort of disapproval were the Italian rabbis demonstrating regarding this? I will then question whether there is any proof of Jewish artists creating at this time, or are most of our creations created by Christian artists? We will then look at some of the Hebrew illuminated manuscripts created in Italy and consider their messages. We will then turn to the question of Jewish music and polyphony at this time. Finally, we will think about the period of ghettoization that concludes our course and see some of the exquisite synagogues and the dissemination of Renaissance architecture within them. So let us start with some Jewish writings and rabbinic responsa. As I am sure we all know, it was the second commandment which ordered Jews not to create images of any kind. But the wording of the Hebrew Bible prevented a simple understanding of this second commandment. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. Its meaning seemed to suggest a prohibition of all figurative art, because humans were made in God's image, and images should never in any way compete with or distract from the admiration of God and his creation. Historically, I would argue that the Jews' aniconism had been a way for them to distinguish themselves sharply and consciously from their neighbors. But because of the need to create in general, rabbinic sources had repeatedly tried to argue that decorative objects, and not figurative ones, were not idols. For example, in Padua, with Rabbi Shmuel Archivolti around 1530 to 1611, he was asked about the propriety of wall paintings in the synagogue. These paintings were simple floral ornamentation, grass and trees and flower stalks. Archivolti attested to the prevalence of this type of ornamentation in the Veneto area, which, he said, we have seen in Venice, where the Ashkenazim, the German Jews, painted their synagogues, and the rabbis did not prevent them. I want to bring in another rabbi who discussed this issue, and this will confirm that Archivolti was not willing to allow figurative art in the synagogue. Rabbi Yosef Karo, the greatest halakhic authority of Archivolti's time, who moved from Toledo to Sfat and lived between 1488 and 1575, even allowed the use of human figures in the synagogue, although this was contrary to his decisions in other related matters. So let us look at his responsa. Question. I was asked whether it is permitted to make a Torah ark curtain from a piece of silk, which is embroidered with varied images, among them figures of birds. Since there were some who were uncertain, saying that when the congregation prays and bows in the direction of the Holy Ark, it would look like, heaven forbid, they were bowing to these figures. And now Caro's response. It appears to me that this is definitely permissible and with no room for doubt. Even had there been in it a human figure, it would be permissible. It therefore appears to me permissible to use this art curtain like any other art curtain, since we have proved that there is no fear of breaking any prohibitions concerning images. Therefore, it is permissible and correct to place it in the synagogue. But Archivolti was not convinced and ruled to forbid all forms of representations. I think one of his arguments is particularly interesting. And this is what he wrote. Forbidding the use of paintings in a synagogue is one of those things that, had it not been written, should have been written. For why should we not be apprehensive about the honor of our God? And why should our synagogues be like inns where guests drink? And why should our synagogues be like comedy theatres? And why should the nations say that we worship the grass of the field and the plants of the earth and other representations? This will bring shame on us. And I think here we see clearly that the stringent halachic ruling on figurative art in the synagogue is maintained in Renaissance Italy. Rabbi Archivolti is prohibiting the holy space of the synagogue to be polluted with figurative art, thereby not allowing congregants to integrate themselves into the world of the visual culture of their time. So what we see are strict rules regarding the synagogue. This needs to be noted at the beginning because figurative art will appear, as I will show you, in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. What about Jewish artists? Do we have any proof of names of artists in the Renaissance? Perhaps we should start with the topical question, was Leonardo da Vinci Jewish? I personally am very excited about this new research of Carlo Vecchi, who has proven that Leonardo's mother was a Caucasian Jewish slave brought to Italy and redeemed by da Vinci's father because he had fallen in love with her. It certainly makes us look at da Vinci's works with new thoughts. But there are a few other names of Jewish artists that emerge at this time. Firstly, Professor Tamar Herzig has recently uncovered the story of Salomone de Sesso, who lived around between 1452 and 1521, one of the most important virtuoso goldsmith artists of Ferrara in the 15th century. His patrons, which included Eleonora of Aragon, her husband Duke Ercole d'Este, their children Duke Alfonso d'Este, and Marchioness Isabella d'Este, and their respective spouses, Lucrezia Borgia and Duke Francesco Gonzaga, and their interactions with Salomone de Sesso show how greatly they relied upon him, especially for the female fashionistas who anxiously awaited the arrival of their glittering ornaments. Well, what did Salomone de Sesso make for these famous women? For Lucrezia Borgia, it seems he made various pieces of jewelry. For Isabella d'Este, he made wonderful bracelets which were to decorate her bare arms in the summer, and also a gold lid that was going to be for her perfume pomander. Salomone de Sesso also made a queen of swords for the military leader Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI. An enameled gold chain and a large gold button commissioned for Lucrezia's brother, Giovanni Borgia, as a gift for the King of France, Francis I. The Jewish goldsmith Salomone de Sesso converts to Christianity in 1491, and this move certainly allowed him more privileges as an artist. But Herzig does not think this is the reason why he converts to Christianity. So Salomone de Sesso is our first example of a Jew participating in the making of jewelry during the Renaissance. In Mantua, scholars have shown that there was a street of Jewish goldsmiths. The Formigini family, who owned a private synagogue at Modena, were also court jewelers to the dukes of the House d'Este, generation after generation, for centuries, though it is unascertainable how far this tradition goes back. A few other names indeed emerge of persons who worked for the Italian courts and for other secular patrons. For example, Master Isaac of Bologna, who was employed by the court of Naples in 1484. And from Bologna too came another person who links up with the most famous goldsmith of the Italian Renaissance, Benvenuto Cellini. In his autobiography, Benvenuto Cellini, the 16th century Christian goldsmith, sculptor and author, speaking of his training and early days, records his experiences at the age of 16. When I reached Bologna, I put myself under a certain école del piffero and began to earn something by my trade. In the meantime, I used to go every day to take my music lesson, and in a few weeks made considerable progress in that accursed art. He obviously didn't like studying music. However, I made still greater in my trade of goldsmith. For the cardinal having given me no assistance, I went to live with a Bolognese illuminator called Scipione Cavalletti, and whilst there I devoted myself to drawing and working for one Grazia Dio, a Jew, with whom I earned considerably. Grazia Dio was, it seems, one of the local Jewish goldsmiths, and there can be little doubt that he guided his young employee in his work. These Jewish goldsmiths' main work was clearly the manufacture of articles of personal adornment rather than Judaica. The setting of the precious stones could sometimes be most elaborate, and in the long run, there was a point where sculpture and metalworking almost overlapped. But we do see the result of their work in certain objects which belonged to Jews, such as the splendid chased or enamelled wedding rings, the one I showed you last week, often decorated with a representation of the temple in Jerusalem. And these rings were produced in great numbers in Venice in the 16th century. This is a little humbler but beautifully elaborate. A Jewish master craftsman from Ferrara named Yeshurun Tovah created between about 1460 and 1480 for a Jewish housewife this exquisite little box, now in the Israel Museum, Jerusalem, to hold the keys of her linen cupboards. It is chased with representations of Jewish domestic scenes in niello work. On the front of the box, which I hope you can see, we see the three main duties of the Jewish wife: lighting Shabbat candles, and here we see her actually lighting a Judenstern, a central lighting; separating the challah, which is separating the bread for Shabbat, which is on the right-hand side, and in the middle we see the woman immersing in the mikveh, in the ritual bath. But if you note the central figure of the nude woman in the mikveh, the artist does not even try to conceal her nakedness. So it seems that in some ways we have moved far away from the second commandment and any fear of figurative art. And now we must turn to some examples of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. A quick note, though, about this type of art. Jews in the Renaissance clearly used art to decorate, sanctify, and endorse their Hebrew texts, which was far more limited in terms of creativity than what Christians were doing on every street corner. And I think this comparison is an important one, because we have to try and sense how Jews felt living in this colourful environment. I don't want us to forget that there must have been some sort of discomfort with the amount of Christian art that there was in Italy. It has made me question, in my own work, how Jews navigated permanent Christian images displayed on external walls and niches. In fact, I would argue that the Jews were the only inhabitants in Italian cities and towns who looked and passed these images or statues without acknowledgement or reaction. We should also note that Jews even confirmed in their statements before different courts that their roots around town often took into account their desire to bypass these objects, so they didn't have to come into any contact with them. We also know now that Italian Jews muttered a certain imprecation as they passed Christian images, and those who stayed at inns or taverns would remove the Christian pictures from the walls of their chambers so as not to have to sleep under their gaze. So now, let us take a look at some of these Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. These particular images that I will show you were created in the height of the Renaissance and were clearly a joint effort by Jewish scribes and Christian artists. They may contain the name of the Jewish scribe or the person who commissioned the work, but usually the name of the talented artist who added the decoration or illustration after the text had been written is missing. And at best, as you'll see, we can only identify the school of illumination. In general, the way that it worked was that after the Jewish scribe had completed the actual text, the work was then entrusted to Gentile hands to illuminate it. This is the Renaissance, and this is where we see particularly the early influence of Italian art. Handwritten, illuminated books were always highly valued, and those who purchased them belonged to a wealthy, educated elite. I think that as a result of this cooperation between Jews and Christians in creating these images, the messages of these images, as I will show you, is not always clear. Hebrew manuscripts commissioned by prosperous Jews, written by Jewish scribes, and sometimes illustrated, I would say even usually illustrated by Christian artists, actually show some very interesting results. And I think it also leads us to an important question. By looking at these images that I will show you, can we argue that these illustrations reflect the meticulous demands of the affluent, wealthy Jewish patrons of these works, or the Christian artists who were given free rein to provide their own depictions of Jewish life? Most of my images come from Hebrew illuminated manuscripts now held in the Vatican Library. We're going to start, as you can see, with Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, the 12th century monumental code of Jewish law compiled by Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who lived between 1135 and 1204. This copy of Maimonides' work comes from northern Italy from the mid-15th century, and without doubt, just by looking at it and seeing its bright colors, we know we have entered Italian Jewish Renaissance art. Most probably more than one artist contributed to the making of this manuscript. The first leaf of the introduction to the Mishnah Torah shows, as you can see here, a group of seated men engaged in study. Their books are open on their laps, and they face their revered teacher, who is seated on a raised throne-like chair in typical Renaissance style. This is what we imagine a yeshiva look like. No women, of course, so these elements seem correct. We already discussed in our second class about learning and what this involved in the yeshiva. Let's move on, but all in the same manuscript of the Mishneh Torah. The panel at the opening of the first book, titled Sefer Mada, the Book of Knowledge, shows a group of astronomers with astrolabes, compasses, and charts. But why a group of scientists? Can we not see the influence of the Christian artists here, who are assuming that Mada means science and not the broader type of knowledge that the Rambam is writing about? Astronomy was the Renaissance man's way of understanding science, even though Maimonides, the Rambam, makes no reference whatsoever to astronomy in his work. So this image makes us think instead of the non-Jewish world of exploration and discovery of new lands. Did this idea then, for the depiction, come from the Jews who felt an affiliation with Renaissance learning on this subject? Or did it more probably come from the Christian artists who misunderstood what was meant by Mada, science? The next slide shows this confusion even more clearly. The Rambam's Mishneh Torah, Sefer Ahava, the Book of Love, addresses the Jews' love of God and how to show that love, and lays down rules that govern human worship. But look what we see here. The panel in the manuscript offers a colourful depiction of knights jousting, perhaps an allusion by the Christian artist to chivalry and courtly love. Think of those romantic poems in which men challenged a fellow admirer of the same woman that they loved in order to win her. Courtly love as opposed to love of God. This hardly relates to the Jewish text. So again, we must ask, does this idea really come from the Jews? Or is it not more likely that the Jewish patron has given full rein for the artist to do as he wished? If we turn to another image in the Mishneh Torah, it can also tell us a lot more about Jewish life at the time. In the same manuscript, the Mishneh Torah, we see the illustration for the third book, Zemanim, Seasons, which deals with the laws of Shabbat, the Sabbath, and the Jewish holidays. And as you can see, and I'm sure you've guessed, this portrays the celebration of Sukkot, tabernacles, and the festival of Purim, the Jewish carnival. On our left is a group of people who are seated around a table in a sukkah, a booth, during the Jewish festival of tabernacles that falls in the autumn. On our right, two elegantly dressed couples dance at a traditional Purim or Carnivale masquerade ball, while a man in the costume of a jester stands behind them. This is certainly more apt for our understanding of Jewish life in the Renaissance. While some rabbis permitted married couples to dance in public, others spoke bitterly of it. But in the set of takanot issued by Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, who was the rabbi of Padua for 45 years until his death in around 1508, mixed dancing between Jewish married couples was only allowed on Purim and also on weddings, which I will speak about in a moment, as was the dancing of unmarried couples as long as they were dressed modestly. A nice Renaissance concession for the youth of the day. So what we have here, without doubt, is a full-blown description of how young Italian Jews behaved at Purim. Now we're going to turn to another Hebrew illuminated manuscript, also in the possession of the Vatican. Jacob ben Asher's Arba'ah Turim. This is a seminal legal code incorporating French, German, and Spanish traditions, written in Spain in the early 14th century by the Ashkenazi scholar Jacob ben Asher, known as the Baal HaTurim by virtue of this magnus opus, the Arba'ah Turim. This illuminated manuscript was made in Mantua in 1435. And here we know that the scribe was the Jew Isaac ben Ovadia. And given the beauty of its artistic style, which is typical of northern Italy, the illustrations in this manuscript must have been produced in one of Lombardy's leading workshops, very likely that of the well-known Christian artist Bonifacio Bembo of Cremona. The entire text has been preserved intact, and the manuscript is one of the rarest and most highly valued in existence. For cultural historians, a wealth of interesting information about Jewish dress and lifestyle in Renaissance Italy may be gleaned from the detailed depictions in these panels. The work is divided into 4 sections and each have an illustration at the beginning, which I will show you. Opening section of Ora Chaim, sorry, I'm just going to go back, shows men standing in prayer inside a synagogue. They wear the Jewish prayer shawl, on which we can even discern the prescribed knotted fringes. Note that there are no women visible, although the assumption might be that they are behind the curtain halfway up the image. There definitely feels like some bustle, some movement behind the curtain. And note the rather Baroque style of the synagogue, the central bima, platform here, and the Shaliach Tzibor, the leader of the prayers, standing behind it. Probably the Sefer Torah has just been removed from the Aron Kodesh, from the Holy Ark, because the doors of the Ark, as you can see, are closed and all the men are standing up. Most of the men are facing the man who's carrying the Sefer Torah, and this seems an authentic and studied image of Jewish prayer in the synagogue. At the beginning of Even HaEzer, the Stone of Help, relating to family law, to marriage and divorce, we see a Jewish wedding being depicted in great detail. Sumptuous clothes, elaborate hats, merriment, musical accompaniment, see the trumpets on the right, an elegant hall with Renaissance perspective. The groom is placing the ring on his bride's finger on the left, although we can't confirm that she is particularly happy at this moment. And the bearded rabbi officiant lends a measure of gravitas, I think, to this occasion. We also see a young couple on the right of the image who are most elegantly and lavishly dressed in the higher style of Renaissance fashion, dancing together. It almost looks like a sophisticated form of dance where both partners know their exact steps. Well, this too fits in with what we know about Jewish dancing in the period. Mixed dancing was required, and rules of modesty that normally forbade such contact between men and women were completely suspended. From the 14th century in Italy, dancing was associated with sophistication and cultural refinement, as it was elsewhere in Europe. Mixed dancing had become one of the main activities at these celebrations, with new dances being created at princely courts. Jewish children, boys and girls, were taught dance by professional teachers from a young age, and boys sometimes attended classes at Christian dance schools. I don't think we should question the covering of the women's hair here as being some sort of religious status, because representations of social dance in Renaissance Italy often depict women, whether married or not, with covered heads in the fashion of the time. Another one, Choshen Mishpat, the breastplate of justice, which deals with civil law and personal relations, is illustrated by a scene showing a Jewish court, a Beit Din. It seems that a trial is in progress, with 23 men present and the Chief Justice, the Nasi, seated again on this magnificent throne at the center, I would argue quite similar to the chair that we saw the teacher sit in the image of the yeshiva. Interestingly, that according to the Mishnah in Sanhedrin 1:6, 23 was the number of judges in the subordinate court known as the small Sanhedrin. Was this then a coincidence, or was the number in this image meant to be exact and was actually requested by the Jewish patron who was making this document? Let us look now at our last image of the Arba Turim. Heading the Tur Yoreh De'ah, which deals with the laws of kashrut, eating kosher, there is a miniature here that depicts 4 men engaged in slaughtering animals, while a woman looks on through an arched door in the far left at the back. Scholars agree that this inclusion of a woman is apparently not accidental. As I said last week, unlike other Jewish communities in Europe, in Mantua, where this manuscript was produced, the profession of the shochet, or kosher slaughterer, was followed both by men and occasionally by women. The noted Mantuan rabbi, Emmanuel de Lattes, gave a local woman an official license to perform shchita, ritual slaughtering. The annals of the Mantuan community also mention women who ran kosher butcheries. So when we look at this image, it seems that this might indeed be a woman in charge who is popping her head round the corner of the butchery to give orders to the 4 men, and not just as an observer looking on. So now let's turn to another wonderful manuscript, the Rothschild Miscellany. The Rothschild Miscellany was commissioned by Moshe ben Yekutiel HaKohen probably around 1470 at the height of the Renaissance in Italy. He was obviously a wealthy Jew and probably a banker. The Rothschild Miscellany, as it is now known, is the most elegantly and lavishly executed Hebrew manuscript of the Renaissance that still exists. Let me hasten also to add, lest anyone be deceived, that the only connection of the manuscript to the Rothschild family is that they bought it and owned it at one point in the 1800s and 1900s. There were no Rothschilds living in northern Italy in the 1400s. A miscellany is a manuscript that contains many unrelated works bound together. The Rothschild Miscellany is a huge prayer book, primarily, but there are about 36 other Hebrew texts together within it, some shorter and some longer, including 3 biblical books, Psalms, Tehillim, Proverbs, and Eov, Job, some halachic Jewish legal works, some works of Jewish philosophy, and some works of medieval Hebrew literature. It illustrates incredibly beautifully almost every custom of daily life in a Jewish Renaissance household. Here again, we see the woman's gallery that we mentioned last time. No other Hebrew manuscript equals the richness and scope of the illumination of this miscellany. Out of the 946 pages, 812 are decorated or illuminated. Like the Arba Turim, this document probably came from the workshop of Bonifacio Bembo and that of Cristoforo de Predis. Obviously, neither of these artists were Jewish. Some of the illustrations as well are of biblical scenes. All have textual illustrations for each festival and prayers for special occasions. The text throughout the manuscript is accompanied by marginal notes and commentaries by the sages. In this case, I would argue that it is clear that the illuminators, the Christian artists, were given meticulous directions by the purchaser, presumably, as to what matter they should include in the illustrations. Unlike the Vatican documents, the illustrations are carefully matched to the Hebrew text. Here we see the Jews' preparation for Pesach, for Passover, cleaning the house, preparing the matzah, the unleavened bread, and putting them in the public ovens. Here we see a beautiful image of an Italian man facing his wife at the Shabbat meal, saying Kiddush, blessing of the wine, before they begin to eat, here with the traditional 2 candles in a candelabra on top of the tablecloth. His chair, by the way, looks far more comfortable than hers. But we still see him looking at his wife, but I'm not sure whether she's actually looking at him and vice versa. Here there are the pictures of the 10 sons of Haman, but not hanging on gallows as the Megillah records, but hanging on a tree. Hanging upon a tree was commonly interpreted to denote crucifixion, the form of execution only used by Romans, since a tree and a cross both meant essentially the same in Roman law, as well as in Aramaic translation. And we do see this image of a tree to hang Haman and his 10 sons in other illuminated manuscripts of the time. Another example here is this illustration of the 4 sons in the Haggadah, a text that traditionally has always attracted illuminators. The artists of the Rothschild miscellany decided that the wise son would not have a book, but would be extremely well dressed. The second son, the wicked son, has a short tunic and a long sword hanging from a belt, pretty standard in medieval illustration, and a club, less standard, in his hand. The simple son looks rather sad. The son who does not know how to ask has a jester's baton. Motifs of the club and the baton are actually borrowed from playing cards and tarot cards of the time. And we should finish this section with noting that from the beginning of the 1500s, illuminated manuscripts are going to become a much less significant artistic genre because of printing. So what we have here, I would say, is this glorious illustration of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts that happens early in the Renaissance, that soon will be replaced by printed works. I wanted also to say something about music and polyphony, because I don't think we should leave our topic without thinking of the Jews' contribution here to music in the Renaissance. Remember how we mentioned the innovation of polyphony in the field of music in Renaissance Italy? The construction of music in which different instruments of voices sing melodies that are separate and different, but intertwined harmoniously. Jews in the Renaissance performed as instrumentalists and singers. They performed in private homes of both Jews and Christians, and vice versa. Jewish musicians taught music to both Jews and Christians. And it seems that they also participated in the busy field of instrument design and creation, serving as instrument dealers and traders. So within their own communities, Jews cultivated music actively. We have mentioned Mantua regularly through our lectures. It emerged sometime in the 1500s as the largest Jewish community in Italy, and it was home not only to the notable Jewish playwright that I mentioned in my second lecture, but the only notable Jewish composer of the period, Salomone di Rossi. As a result, Mantua Jewish musical theatre was so highly prized that the Gonzagas required the Jews to perform musical theatre for them annually. Salomone di Rossi wrote a number of volumes of light music and wrote one volume of Jewish texts, mainly psalms in Hebrew, set to music, the first example of polyphony in Jewish music. His work spread outside of Italy. One book was reprinted in Antwerp, and two of his madrigals are in an anthology published in Copenhagen in 1605. His madrigals were also copied in England about the same time until changing musical styles made his work seem out of date. When Rabbi Leon de Modena introduced de Rossi's music into the service of his synagogue in Ferrara, detractors claimed that a cappella harmonization violated halachic Jewish legal prohibitions against celebratory music making in synagogue. In response to this episode, Modena authored his Teshuvah, his response, laying out his own justification for the cultivation of musical education and musical practice within the Jewish community. It is incredibly striking to see a rabbi support and see Rossi's innovations as operating within a Jewish framework. Modena went out of his way to frame the entire field of music as a Jewish one. In his understanding, the development of Christian music was a historical anomaly that required correction. Music was an ancient Jewish art, one that had been, quote, stolen from the land of the Hebrews. In Rabbi Modena's understanding, it was time for Jews to reclaim their lost tradition and reassert their primacy in the practice of music. Jews in early modern Italy made music of all kinds, and in doing so, he argued, they rendered it all part of Jewish history and identity. But other rabbis disagreed, such as Rabbi Moshe Coimbram of Ferrara. Coimbram stated that from a halachic, a Jewish legal perspective, such musical composition was an art form that developed over centuries in association with the evolution of musical styles used in European churches. Therefore, it was essentially connected to non-Jewish musical traditions. Unfortunately, Salomone di Rossi's musical innovations in synagogues led nowhere. Rossi's compositions stood as the only exemplars of liturgical Hebrew compositions for centuries, and his work, unfortunately, had no immediate successors, and no other polyphonic synagogue music appeared in print until the 19th century. The reasons why others in Rossi's circle did not pick up his cue to write such music for the synagogue are actually unclear. So now, in our last lecture together, for the last few moments, I think we should move to the change in atmosphere that happens in Italy from 1516, with the establishment of the first Jewish ghetto in Venice, and then continued in other parts of Italy for the next 160 years. As a result of the Counter-Reformation and the Pope's desire to strengthen Catholicism in light of the challenges of Protestantism in Germany, which was now taking root in many of Italy's neighboring states, Jews began to be confined to ghettos. The birth of the ghetto as a place of enforced habitation, on the one hand, was a symbol of oppression. The ghetto's huge walls starkly delimited the narrow confines and somber isolation of Italian Jewry. But ironically, ghetto walls also represented tolerance, albeit a limited sort of tolerance. For when the ghetto of Venice was first established in 1516, most of Western Europe had expelled its Jews altogether. How did the Jews feel about the ghetto? Well, I don't think that the creation of this enclosure led to massive changes in Jewish society. Jewish institutions, internal life, contacts with the outside world remained roughly what they had been previously. As Robert Bonfield and Kenneth Stowe and others have argued, the physical boundaries of the ghetto paradoxically made contact with the Christian world less threatening and that world itself more accessible. Synagogues continued to function both ritually and socially. In their original conception, synagogues provided sacral focal points. They served as forums for those who prayed according to the various Italian, Ponentine, Sephardic, or Ashkenazic forms of prayer. And it was this freedom of interaction that also enabled the Jews to rely on Christian artists and architects to provide for their needs whenever necessary. And now we see some of the most beautiful synagogues in Italy being built. The synagogues of the Italian ghettos, and here I wanted to share with you by far my favorite synagogue in Italy, in Casale Monferrato, a place that in Piedmonte that everybody should visit. And you cannot enter this ghetto synagogue without opening your mouth in complete admiration for its beauty. Most impressive in their interior grandeur than it's their pre-ghetto synagogues. The new Italian synagogue comes together with elaborately decorated ritual objects, not just the ark, the bimah, and the non-ritual lamps, but the silver crowns of the Torah, the filials, as you see here, the rich fabric hangings, and so on. It is probable that these decorations were not made by Jewish hands. For example, it is known that the superb Ponentine, Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Venice, which dates back to 1584, but was reconstructed in 1655, was the work of Baldassare Longhena, the most eminent Venetian architect of the day, whose magnificent church of Santa Maria della Salute, my favorite church of all times, here, I can show it to you here. No, I've missed it. I'm just going to go back to show it to you. Sorry about that. No, okay. Not here. Okay. No worries. Is one of the most prominent features of the Venetian lagoon. Other Italian synagogues dating back to this period, some of them such as that of Pesaro, were no doubt constructed similarly by Christian architects. So here, in fact, we have no direct evidence so far of Jewish craftsmanship or of Jewish architecture. What we see instead is the stylistic influences of Renaissance architecture being incorporated by Christian architects into synagogue structures. But more so, the Italian synagogues of this period initiated one of the relatively few structural changes in the history of the synagogue interior. In place of a bimah and holy ark, the Aron Kodesh, close together, or the bimah in the center, the Italians invented the two foci synagogue, with the holy ark in front, as it had been, and the bimah, as you can see here in the back. They are at opposite ends of the synagogue, and this design was maintained from this period onwards. The bima and the ark were now often elevated with steps or even a curving staircase. Rabbi Leon de Modena supported and even encouraged the development of Jewish visual art in the ghetto, which reached its peak during the last years of his life and the decades after his death. And there are two texts that I want to finish up with, because I think they tell us so much, not only about Leon de Modena, but about Italian Jewish life. On the one hand, we see the strictness regarding human figures, if there is any danger that they might be worshipped. But regarding portraits of people and with books to be used in the home, he is particularly lenient. He was asked regarding silver spice boxes with human figures in relief, literally protruding from the image, whether they can be used for blessing and smelling on the termination of Shabbat, for Havdalah, for the service that separates the Shabbat from the week, or not. And Modena decided to forbid it, and this is what he wrote. I will not now enter into a discussion whether protruding human figures, which are not intended for ceremonial use, can be used even though it is not permitted to make them. But I will say that, in my humble opinion, one should be stringent in this matter and forbid it, as these figures are made for a vessel that is used for a mitzvah blessing, and when smelling the spices, they are brought close to the face, which looks like one is kissing the figure. This is somewhat similar to faces carved on fountains for idol worship, from which one should not be drinking water, as this would look like kissing the idol. Even if, in this case, this is not being done with faces of idols as such, nevertheless, it looks like kissing the idol while performing the blessing and mentioning God's name, and it is indeed proper to forbid this. So that's what he has to say about an object that is brought close to the face. If it has any sort of figure, human figure upon it, there is a danger here that by kissing it, or by bringing it to the face to smell it, it would feel like you are kissing it and therefore treating it as such an idol. So what he's being very clear about is saying, I do not want to see any human depictions on this smelling artifact. And now regarding portraits in the home, this is what he says. They, the Jews, do not have painted figures, images or statues in the home, and certainly not in the synagogue and in their holy places, as it is written in Exodus chapter 20, here we have the second commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee a graven image, nor any manner of likeness, etc. And also in many other places. However, in Italy, many Jews take the liberty of having portraits and pictures in their houses, especially if they are not in relief nor whole bodies. And for me, this is the moment when I really sense that Leon de Modena is responding to the beauty of the creative art that he's seeing around him and saying, okay, I'll be strict about the synagogues, but let me be lenient about bringing some of this beautiful artwork into my own home. And indeed, he did not see anything wrong in figurative representations for use in the home as long as they were not three-dimensional. And look at his own portraiture that appears on his Historia de Riti Ebraici. Without doubt, he saw nothing wrong with putting an image of himself at this point on the printed version of one of his works. So I want now to conclude not just this session, but our 4 weeks together. We have witnessed, and I hope you will all agree with me, an absorption of Renaissance ideas, designs, concepts that affected Jewish life in early modern Italy in a positive and deep way. We have seen the extent to which Italian Jews developed intellectually and culturally during this period, and the extent to which they were willing to share their own developments, particularly in Kabbalah, with the non-Jewish world. We have noted how Renaissance humanism affected the Jews in their own study of rhetoric, Jewish history, theatre, music, the arts, and philosophy. We've also described what new institutions Jews established that were similar to Christian societal ones. Last week, we noted that Jewish women did not have an emancipation, but took notable steps in the field of female literacy. And today, we have seen the richness of Jewish objects, how Jews carefully negotiated their positions around the proliferation of visual arts in Renaissance Italy. And we have touched upon the very openness of some of the rabbis at the time, such as Rabbi Leon de Modena. In contrast to the ruling of preceding rabbis, he encouraged accommodating the artistic needs of his community and did not reject them without consideration. In my mind, Rabbi Leon de Modena represented the very openness and controlled receptiveness that we have witnessed of the Jewish communities in Renaissance Italy. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining me. I also want to thank Chagai and Tamar and all the Beit Avichai team for making the production of these lectures possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy. This has been a pleasure. You're taking us on a tour and explaining the treasures of the Jewish community in the past to us. We do have a few questions. And one question regarding the different illuminated texts from the Vatican. How did these texts end up in the Vatican?
Well, it's a long story, and we mustn't assume that this is always a negative one. At the time when these manuscripts were actually being sold at various auctions, there were a lot of very clever collectors in the Vatican who collected them. We know that there are something like almost 800 Hebrew illuminated manuscripts in the Vatican, and the Vatican was very kind to allow these to actually be brought to Israel as they were in 2005. And we were actually, at that time, we had a wonderful correspondence and meeting with some of the Vatican librarians, and they were very clear that these were just things that they had bought at various stages, and that's what we know.
Okay. Now a question referring to one of the earlier pictures we saw, where we saw men sitting in the yeshiva. So someone in the audience wanted to know if they were wearing kippot.
We don't see them wearing kippot at this time. In this particular time, the head covering is not clear. It wasn't assumed that men had to cover their hair at their heads at this stage.
Would you say that to this day there's a difference between the Jewish community in Italy and other Jewish communities? They seem unique during the Renaissance, and would you say it continues today?
I think the Italian Jews in general have a wonderful appreciation of their culture. As we've said before, that Rome has is the oldest Jewish community in Europe, and in many ways they look after and they're very attached to their traditions, and that's a wonderful thing. And one senses that in the beauty of these synagogues. Let me just point out that maybe in the future we could discuss this. Piedmonte is the place to visit the really beautiful synagogues that are still extant. There are at least 18 synagogues within ghettos, tiny ghettos, and Casale Monferrato that I showed you today is really the most beautiful one. But if you really want to get the sense of how Jews, even after they were enclosed in ghettos, put in love and dedication to the beautification of the synagogue, we sense that every time we go in. It's almost like the contrast between the outside of the synagogue and the inside. From the outside, as I'm sure many of you have seen in Venice, you only know it's a synagogue because of the very large windows in the main square of the Ghetto Nuovo. But you don't see anything on the outside, but in the inside you feel it. It's absolutely incredible. And for me, that is the real proliferation, dissemination of Renaissance architecture.
Okay, and I think one last question. Did the expulsion of Jews from different parts of Europe have an effect on the life of Jewish Italians? Italian Jews?
Course, and this is something that we talked about in our first lecture with the coming of the Jews after the expulsion of Spain. For the first time, Italian and German Jews in Italy are dealing with an immigration into their whole culture and lifestyle of Jews that came from Ponentine, that came from Spain and Portugal, that came from the Levant. They'd gone first to Ottoman lands and then they came to Italy. So what we have in Italy, and this is something I've tried to explain, is many different synagogues in one place to allow for the different expressions of the different Jews living there. And it takes a few generations before they will actually intermarry. They don't intermarry at first, they all stick to their own, but then eventually we see them mingling better.
Okay, so I will allow one last question. The question is there one of the Italian synagogues is reconstructed in a museum here in Israel? Could you say which one that is?
Of the Veneto synagogues, and we're talking, well, there's actually a few. There's one in the Italian Museum in Jerusalem, and there's also one in the Israel Museum, which is a different one. But they have been brought to Israel. So we're really talking about two main ones, and actually sort of complete synagogues that have been put up again in Jerusalem. Definitely worthwhile coming to visit.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy, for this whole series. It was wonderful, and you gave us the histories, the art, the pictures and details. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to continue seeing you in future Beit Avichai events.